I've undertaken to talk about professional listing and engineering work identification and what does this entail for structural engineers. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is a topic that has been ongoing for the better part of the last 2 decades. So let's just try and see where we've come from and where we're potentially going to. I think the starting point is, what is structural engineering? And I've taken just the definitions that we've used in the past as being the science and art of designing and constructing with economy and elegance, building bridges and frameworks and other structures so that they satisfy safety, serviceability, durability requirements under intended use conditions. And I think we all understand that there's 3 components to structural engineering: the structural safety, which is about the strength and stability under actions; the serviceability, to perform within established parameters under all expected actions; and we've also got the structural durability, which is to fulfill the intended safety and serviceability performance over a specified working life, subject to maintenance schedule and specific component design lives. I think we're all familiar with that. If we think about structural engineering, I think the starting point for me, and this is my own perspective, is that structural engineering is a high-risk engineering practice area. And if you start thinking about the structural safety, serviceability, and durability, we've seen in the last few years, even in the last year, some terrible things in Genoa where a bridge came down and where the Florida building that collapsed due to lack of maintenance. So we have 2 sides of it with structural engineering, that and the design. And there's an example of punching shear in a building which collapsed. So we have, from a design and a maintenance side, to ensure that structural durability exists, that structures continue to perform as intended. If we now move to the identification of engineering work, and I'll just touch upon, I have put up the text from the various acts so that if you look at it afterwards, you can quickly locate where things are. I will just touch upon them very quickly. The first thing I think we've got to remember is there's the Competition Act, and the Competition Act says a professional association may apply to the Competition Commission to have all or any part of its rules exempted from the provisions of the Act. And the rules that the Act is concerned with is any rules that we have as a profession that effectively substantially prevent or lessening competition in a market is something that one requires exemption from. And the rules that contain a restriction, if they do permit it, they're going to look at international norms, and it would have to be reasonably required to maintain professional standards or the ordinary function of the profession. Now, the Engineering Act, the ECSA Act that came out in 2000, had provisions for identification of work. And the idea here was that the council must consult with all and sundry, the voluntary associations, etc., that may be affected by laws regulating the built environment profession regarding the identification of the type of engineering work which may be performed by persons registered in any category of registration, including work which may fall within the scope of any other profession. So right from the outset, the Act made provision for identification of work, but recognized that there would be overlaps between professions within the built environment. Now, the Engineering Professions Act also states that after this process of consultation, Council must submit recommendations to the CBE regarding the identification of work. And after that, a person who is not registered in terms of the Act may not perform any kind of work identified for any category of registered persons, or hold himself out to be a registered person, use the name, so it reserved the name, and perform any act indicating or calculated to lead a person to believe that he's registered. But it doesn't prevent anyone working under the direction of a registered person to perform a service. So that's essentially what the focus of work identification was. Now, the Council for the Built Environment Act, which is the overarching act, which was also published in 2000, states that the Council, that's the Built Environment Council, after receiving the recommendations of councils for the profession, and before liaising with the Competition Commission, must determine policy. And there's been long arguments about what that policy should look like. There's also consult with any person that might be affected. And then the councils, after consultation, with the Competition Commission and in consultation with the Council for the Professions, identify the scope of work for every category of registered persons. So what we see is, on the one hand, in the Engineering Act, one is talking about work identification, and you're talking with the Council for the Built Environment, the identification of the scope of work of every category of registered person. Now, there's been huge issues over this. I can recall being involved in 2005 to 2008, I think, with ECSA, where ECSA went and developed what they wanted to do over work identification. I eventually left the ECSA group, disagreed with they would not take a stance on looking at the higher risk areas of the Act. They wanted to be generic and all things to all people. And eventually there was even arguments between them and the Council for the Built Environment. I batted for the Council for the Built Environment. And all of these things have gone on, but nothing has been resolved. Now, the issues to resolve is, first of all, with engineering, we have this engineer, technologist, technician, and certificated engineer. And what does this actually mean? What are the differences between them? And this is where one of the big areas in engineering has been, is who's who does what. There is also the problem is that we're not like the architects, where everybody works within the construction industry or the built environment, if you will. We have infrastructure related work and we have non-infrastructure related work. We have mining operations, we have mechanical, electrical, chemical, electrochemical, metallurgical processes, heat treatments, all of those kind of things, as well as what we would see in the built environment. So there is where there are concerns. There's also a lot of concerns over the overlap, particularly when you come to management of construction works. There's overlaps with all the other professions. And then you've got to throw into the mix as well, you've got the property valuers and, you know, how do they fit in with this profession? So all of these kind of things makes it extremely difficult to chart a way through as to what is work identification and what is the scope of work. Now, the submission was made to the Council, the Competition Commission, to get exemption from the rules so that work identification could come in, because it was seen to be restrictive in terms of restricting people to work in particular areas. Now, the Competition Commission rejected this during 2016, the application filed on behalf of ECSA, and they pointed out that there exists existing legislation in the sector that caters for public health, safety, financial risks associated with the work undertaken within the built environment, which, if used effectively, and I think that's the big thing, if it's used effectively, should suffice in protecting consumers of the built environment professional services from any wrongdoing or underperformance by persons offering engineering services. Now, if you go through this entire thing and you look at the acts that actually apply to civil engineering, you'll see that there's not a lot. We have national building regulations, and you see structural assessments there. Housing Consumer Protection Measures Act, sure, we've got structural assessments. We have the Sectional Title Act, there's structural assessments. There's National Road Traffic Signaling in the Road Traffic Act, and we have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and we also have the National Water Act. So, in fact, the high areas or high risk areas of our profession are already legislated in terms of who may do and perform certain functions in legislation. So Competition Commission was essentially saying, well, you've got it covered. Why on earth do you want to now extend it to everyone and have everyone scope of work identified? However, what has happened, there has been some movement. In 2019, the Council for the Built Environment, after consultation with the Competition Commission, identified the scope of every category of registered person. Now, I'll show you the way in which it's been formulated for the architectural profession, because I think it's relatively easy and straightforward to do. They have a professional architect who's registered with the council. They give a level descriptor, and they say he's good to go with multi-story, multifunctional, and complex building types. Then you go through the professional senior architectural technology, which is now multi-story buildings and long-span structures. You then have the architectural technologist, which is simple double-story buildings, and you come down to your professional architectural draftsman, which purely looks at some single dwelling unit. There I can understand very easily for a member of the public, if you know who you want to get hold of to do work for you, you can do it categorized on what is your type of building, and very simply, that's how the scope of work has been put together. Same is not true of the Engineering Council, because we do have a lot more complexity. Now, I'm not going to go through all the bits and pieces here, but what I do want to say is that just some of the areas to highlight, just that you get a flavor of the approach. The whole level descriptor for a professional engineer is a professional engineer is concerned primarily with the progress of technology through innovation, creativity, and change. Their work involves the application of a significant range of fundamental principles, enabling them to develop and apply new technologies, promote advanced designs and design methods, pioneer new engineering services, etc. And then they bring into the scope of work the whole issue of complex engineering activities, and then give a whole lot of tests as to what is a complex engineering activity. Then to differentiate with the professional engineering technologist, they turn around and they say the person, by virtue of his competence, etc., the activities that such a person can perform is design, planning, investigation, problem resolution, improvement of materials, components, systems of processes, implementation, manufacturing or construction, engineering operation, maintenance, project management, research development, and commercialization. And then they come along and they say the scope of work is broadly defined engineering activities. So now you've got to think about it for yourself. How do you define what is complex engineering activities and what is broadly defined? Even if we look at the civil engineering profession, and I treat structural engineers as a subset, I can remember having discussions with Tom Fuchs, who was the former DG of ICE, and he was a mechanical engineer. He said, you know, the civils are so different to the mechanicals because we mechanicals deal with first principles, you guys deal with codes of practice, which is really broadly defined activities to some extent. So there's a huge issue of trying to sort things out. One of the other issues is that the architects, QSs, and all the rest of them put down their stages of work and said, these are the stages that we work. When it came to the engineers, there were no stages of work, and people were now saying, but how does this fit in when you work as part of a building team? So what has happened is ECSA has now published their Work Identification Regulations 2021. My understanding of the legislation is regulations is not permitted to issue. I don't know why they've called it regulations. This is very, very much the same as what ECSA did in about 2008, 2009 in publishing draft regulations. They were adamant that the minister would have to give regulations, but if you read the acts and things like this, it doesn't happen like that. You've got to get your permission through the Competition Commission. But be that as it may, my understanding is that ECSA is engaging with people to try and use this as a basis to formalize what their work identification is and hopefully square it up with the Competition Commission. So what they've done in this notice, and I think the more important part, is to try and get an understanding of the thinking of where they're going, rather than whether this is a legal instrument and whether they're entitled to put it out. They've defined engineering work as the process of applying engineering and scientific principle concepts, contextual and engineering knowledge in the research, planning, design, and management of work in both the natural and built environments. Then what it says is when you come to identified engineering work, so you're first of all looking, is it falling within the definition of engineering work if you're going to go for work identification? Does it entail the engineering activities performed by a registered person in one of the categories? Then you've got to look through to perform the core competencies within a competency area. And so everything is broken down into the criteria for category differentiation is a complex, broadly defined, well-defined, and specifically defined engineering problem, and a complex, broadly defined, well-defined, and specifically defined engineering activity. Very, very difficult to apply, and I don't know how you're ever going to enforce it because there are so many interpretations over what complex and broadly defined is. Nevertheless, they continue with including core services performed by persons. And so what they've then done is they've linked the engineer technology, certificated engineer technician, specified category to come up with competency areas to perform the core services and competency areas assessed against competency indicators. I have no problem with this whole classification if it is used to determine entry to the profession in a particular category, because at the end of the day, it is really saying a professional in the profession needs to have these core competencies. But how you're going to apply it in practice to differentiate between engineering disciplines and performing core services in terms of a scope of work to try and categorize who does what becomes increasingly difficult. But to just give you a bit of a taste, when it comes to the civil engineering discipline, they say the core services in the civil engineering discipline consists of analysis, planning, design, development, manufacture, construction, management, maintenance, and operation of works. And there they list a whole lot of types of civil engineering work: structures, transportation, supply and treatment of systems, result of operations such as dredging, earthworks, waste disposal. So what you've really done is you've given a scope of what the types of projects that civil engineers would be engaged in. Then they come to the core services and they break it down as structural engineering work, geotech, transportation, environmental, hydraulic, and municipal. Once again, having some broad sub-disciplines in civil engineering. Quite interesting, if you're following some of the debates with the Institution of Civil Engineers, they're now starting to want to bring in a chartered, not only a chartered civil engineer, but a chartered infrastructure engineer, because civil engineering was really to demarcate between military and civil. And we're now going into so many different aspects of infrastructure systems that maybe that's where it's got to go. So even in other countries, there's differences in approach as to where the industry is growing. Be that as may, structural engineering work is defined as dams, buildings, dams, bridges, roads, harbors, railways, relating to the safety and serviceability of both the temporary and permanent works and the structures that provide shelter, carry loads, or retain materials and fluids. Once again, defining what structural engineers would do. They also then bring out the scope of work or the scope of services to try and link it in with the other built environment professionals, so that engineers are not out on a limb, that when a client comes along and says, I need a project done, oh, there's no work for an engineer because there's no scope in terms of stages. So they've brought this in terms of the regulations, and there you see the 6 normal stages that all the other professions have, but they've added in for engineering infrastructure only the operation, maintenance, and shutdown permanently and decommissioning of infrastructure to broaden it. They brought in definitions for construction works, for engineering projects, and engineering infrastructures. So that's where we sit at the moment. I personally have a different view, and I have difficulty with this whole breaking the profession up into engineers and technologists, because I see essentially that one is a more theoretical route, one is a more practical route. People might have different views, but I've always seen it as that you eventually arrive at a stage where you're doing similar work to a large extent. We don't have too many of our professional engineers doing these complex, cutting-edge, brand new technologies, etc. Now, Duke's University did a few years ago some research into it, and they took a different view. They said the 2 tracks in engineering was dynamic engineers and transactional engineers. So dynamic engineers are those who are capable of abstract thinking, solving high-level problems, thrive in teams, work well across international borders, have strong interpersonal skills, and are capable of leading innovation. Those are the ones that would move between professions, between disciplines, and it's a very small percentage. The vast majority are transactional engineers who possess engineering fundamentals, and they are viewed as largely being responsible for rote and repetitive tasks in the workforce. And to a large extent, a lot of the work we do falls into that category, hence my comments about the professional engineer and professional engineering technologist meeting at some sort of point. However, the researchers do point out that one of the key differentiators between the 2 types of engineers is their education. The higher the level of education, the more likely you produce a dynamic engineer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the case. There's no hard and fast rules, because one can cite engineers that have done extremely well with very weak educational qualifications. Now, I think we've got to start asking some questions and see where we go with all of this in the future, because we've been bickering for the last 20 years or so as to this work identification, trying to get it in, trying to get the scopes of work sorted out, that we get everything sorted out. So I think we've got to ask the question, are we looking inward or are we looking outward? If we're looking inwards, we're looking to a profession, and it smacks of carving up the engineering cake. In other words, we have an engineering cake and we're going to say who does what within that cake. If we start looking outward, we've then got to start looking at public and employers, and we've then got to start assisting with who to employ to do what. So one is looking at the entry into a profession, and in a profession, what is the sort of area you're going to work in? Whereas the other, and that, of course, one of the difficulties that always came out in all the work that was done on work identification is a lot of people start in an area of engineering and get registered in that area and move into something else during their career. And how is that all catered for? Whereas on the other side, with the public and employer, you're looking at jobs. If I have a job, who am I going to employ for that job? So let's explore the public employer side of things. If we come back to our legislation regarding the planning, design, construction, and maintenance of buildings, we will see that the owner is responsible for complying with building regulations. The home builder is required to comply with the NHBRC technical requirements, and the client has to deal with the occupational health and safety. Now, all of the owners, home builders, and clients are all reliant on structural engineers to meet their legal obligations. So the key question comes is, if we're going to effectively implement these legislation to protect the public, which the Competition Commission recognized, is how do we recognize competence? How do we allocate a competent person to perform particular topics? And I think we've seen over the years, this is an picture, old slide I've had from a collapse that occurred in 2008, where you had a 3-story building that had undersized foundations, no top steel in slab. They put saw cuts in the slab, in suspended slabs, and with an inevitable result of it collapsing. This was designed by a professional engineer who completed all the A19 forms, and it collapsed and killed 2 people. It didn't protect, because what happened is the person didn't know what he didn't know, and that caused failure. The collapse was triggered by one of the ground floor columns punching its way through the ground floor slab, and a progressive collapse occurred. In fact, it was so bad that when Tony Amo was appointed by the department to demolish it, to oversee its demolishing, you can see the back actor that came along on the end and just tapped the building on the one side, and it collapsed in 3 seconds flat. So there's no protection here for the public. The protection for the developer, professional indemnity didn't cover recklessness, so the claim was denied. They removed the engineer from the register, but it didn't provide relief to anyone. So one has got to ask the questions about work identification. Is it going to help the public? Is it going to help the employer? And I think what we've understood with structural failures, most of the cause of structural failures, and this comes from some work that was done internationally that looked at large-scale, widespread across the world where failures occurred, and most of it, 2/3 of it, comes into insufficient knowledge, underestimation of the influence, ignorance, carelessness, and negligence. So if you've got contextual knowledge, and you've got that sorted out with assessing a person's competence, you're well on the way to resolving the issue. If we come to some of the modern issues that we have, and I see this quite often, where people go through a procurement process in government, which is very much a tick box, buyer-driven process. And you know, if you're a professional engineer or you're a professional engineering technologist, you can do structures. And so you can have a look at some of these failures that occurred. You have a look at the profile of the person, and you see the person might understand civil engineering, but has no understanding of structures. Here is a structure that was built. You can see this bottom floor all on stilts. There's no shear walls whatsoever. The first vibrations you're going to get through that area, you're going to have a collapse. The whole lot is going to come down. You have unbalanced cantilevers on the ends. So they're already drooping down and causing the gable end walls to come down. You're putting bending into slender round columns. You have very, very excessive. This one, they're going to wrap this thing round with cladding. And you can see the length of some of these columns that you've got. I don't think they comply with any code of practice that I'm aware of, and too slender. This is a collapse in the weighting. It's been detected, been rectified, and it's one of many. I have lots of people tell me the problems that are being incurred in having the inappropriate person appointed to do work, and the taxpayer pays up for it. So I think we've got to start looking, and I want to spend the last section of the talk in trying to look at where we're going into the future and what we may want to do. To me, what I'm beginning to see is quality management thinking coming in. And if you start looking at some of these standards, they're all coming in since about 2015. They've really been refined. If we look at competence defined in terms of a quality management system, is an ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve intended results. If you look at quality management systems, it says the organization shall determine the necessary competence of people doing work under its control that affects the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system, ensure that these persons are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, or experience, and to retain appropriate documented evidence of competence. And obviously that's going to be linked into the whole auditing and governance processes that we go through at the moment. And then you have the quality management to achieve sustained success is very clearly people associated with individual processes must have the competence needed for the task and activities involved. So to me, the key question is, how do employers identify staff who are competent to design structures and make structural determinations? I can't see work identification and scope of work assisting with that. And how do clients identify consultants to assume or to provide the structural engineering service, or under whose active and personal direction, control, and supervision such services are provided? Because that is critical. To me, the starting point in mitigating risks relating to structural failure or substandard performance is to be able to identify structural engineering competencies amongst persons registered with ECSA. Now, ECSA's approach to registration is we go through the process of education, you have some experience, and then you're registered. And to me, registration is purely admission to a profession in broad. You can work independently, doesn't necessarily mean you're competent to undertake specific tasks. It doesn't test that. Now, the JSD and IStructE-SA and SIC with the JSD approach to structural engineering, we've heard about this all in the past. We have a list of structural engineers, and the idea there is one wanted to go the next level up and say, it's good enough just having registration, but if you've got registration, have 5 years experience. If you want to move the next level up, is have some kind of assessment of your credentials, whether it be through membership of the institution, whether it be submitting yourself to a peer review from a committee, a voluntary listing, or whether you're going to have structural engineering expertise that you've taken in other countries. You've passed some examination in structural engineering, and maybe the pinnacle at the top is a fellow of the institution. And the idea there was what we would have is the various levels of the 4 levels that was put into this would then map into low risk simple structures, medium risk structures, and high risk structures to give some idea of where you are in terms of your structure as to what type of person you need. Now, I think a step change is required, and this is something that is sort of starting to emerge. ECSA registration gives potential to perform structural engineering services, and I think we need to have the demonstrated ability to perform structural engineering services. And the way in which this is done, there is an international standard which has also been adopted by South Africa, is ISO 17204, conformity assessments, general requirements for bodies operating certification of people. And it contains principles and the requirements for a body certifying persons against specific requirements and includes the development and maintenance of a certification scheme for persons. Now, what I found really interesting is that FIDIC has actually set up a credentialing body called FIDIC Credentialing Ltd, which is to certify a body of global consulting professionals. And this is established in 2009 to offer certification and professional development services to various professionals and infrastructure industry experts wishing to broaden their knowledge and expertise. They are currently looking at certifying consulting engineers, contract managers, future leaders, FIDIC trainers, and dispute adjudicators. I am, in fact, a board member of FIDIC Credentialing, and we're looking to develop it all around the ISO 17208 and have it even certified by, for conformity to it by the Swiss Standards Institute. It's also interesting to see that credentialing to SANS 17204 is mentioned in the draft Infrastructure Plan 2050, which is out for comment currently. Let's try and just understand this in the last little bit. I'll try and wrap up just to give you some taste of what credentialing could be and how we could slot it in. If we think about the ISO 17024, it says the principles is certification provides a means of providing assurance that a certified person meets the scheme requirements. So you set out a scheme requirement and you certify that a person satisfies those requirements. One of the characteristic functions of the certification body is to conduct an examination which uses objective criteria to measure competence and scoring. It also, you can't have the same organization doing the training and certification, and that's why FIDIC has set up a separate body to do the certification from what does the training. Certification shall not be restricted on the grounds of undue financial or other limiting conditions or membership of an association or group. Certification body does not use procedures to unfairly inhibit or provide access by participants, applicants, and candidates. So it's not an elite old boys club. And certification body shall make publicly available the scope of the certification scheme and a general description of the certification process. And that's where it's got the scope of certification, required competence, prerequisites, job and task description, abilities, and code of conduct. I will very quickly go through how this could be done in South Africa. This is using the current listing scheme that we've got for the for IStructE-SA. We had all the requirements put out, and if I just map it into the situation, one can get some idea of what would happen with certification. I have shared it with the IStructE-SA committee, and it's certainly one of the things we will be looking into in depth next year and to panel beat it. But let's just give a high level run through. The scope of the certification scheme would be a certified structural engineer determines or confirms the structural safety and structural serviceability performance of structures during their working life. The scope of so that's the scope. We could then go into the job, task, and competence analysis, and we have published with the list of structural engineers. We have the competencies, the 5 competencies. We have the scope of tasks, so people know how they're going to be assessed. We have the competencies, communicate the environment within which structural engineering is practiced, produce viable structural solutions within the scope of a design brief, determine and document the form and size of principal structural elements, specify and coordinate the use of primary structural materials, and communicate construction techniques and sequencing for structural engineering works. So there you've got your competence criteria that you can assess people against that competence. We can add, ISO does permit prerequisites, and prerequisites are qualifications prior to a person taking any examination. And there we can have professional registration as a professional engineer or professional engineering technologist with the Engineering Council. We can certainly expand it through the region in Southern Africa to include other registrations, but that's very much the same as what we've currently got in the listing scheme. The code of conduct, we can link it to the ECSA rules and also provide services in accordance with the standard for structural engineering services. And then we can come along with the criteria and assessment methods for initial certification. And this is just by example, is very much what we've currently got for the listing. is you can demonstrate those 5 outcomes that I've previously shown by through a submission of a portfolio of work and an interview conducted by a committee, in other words, a peer assessment, the passing of the IStructE membership or associate membership examination. Doesn't mean to say you have to become a member of the institution, but if you pass the exam, corporate membership of the institution of structural engineers, or membership of a body which assesses structural engineering competence, such as in Chinese practice or in the United States, they have licensing. Any of those kind of things, you've demonstrated those 5 outcomes in an equivalent manner. One can also have the criteria for recertification, because you can say it's recertified every 3 years or 5 years, and we can link it to maintaining professional registration, CPD requirements, and we can add in whatever any other requirements we want in it. We have suspension from withdrawing the certification, failure to pay fees, or failure to recertify, or to abide by the scheme rules. So I think that's where I wanted to take it, to just try and give you some idea of professional listing, engineering work identification, and what does this entail for the structural engineer. I certainly think that we're going to move away from the business of trying to have work identification, whereas I think the future is going to be registration with these councils will mean that you've been admitted and recognized as a member of the profession, which is a very good base to start from. But for specific tasks and for specific jobs that are to be done, I think credentialing is going to be the way of the future. Thank you very much.